Hello, my spider friends. I'm here today to talk to you about a movie, what I saw. That movie was um, The Power of the Dog, and it was on Netflix. You may have made already some summary from the thumbnail of this video, but we're gonna discuss it. Basically, for me, this movie is Brokeback Mountain meets Hannibal. And I shall tell you for why as I discuss the movie. But what I'm going to have to preface this with is, like, major spoilers, because I really can't talk about the movie without talking about what happens in the movie. I didn't know what this movie was going to be about. I literally was just looking for a movie to watch on Netflix, and I was like, oh, Benedict Cumberbatch, it looks like a Western. I'll see what this is about, and I started playing the movie. And so what the movie is about a couple of ranchers. It's the tail end of the Western era. It's like the 1920s. And Benedict Cumberbatch plays an evil ranch guy called Phil. And Phil, every bad thing that happens to Phil in this movie is entirely Phil's fault, because he's a stupid bad man who treats people terribly. Everything that happens is a direct result of him being horrible to people for no reason. So in the movie, Benedict Cumberbatch is Phil, and his brother is George, and he's played by Jesse Plemons. And you may be familiar with Jesse Plemons. He was in Fargo, he was in Jungle Cruise. He looks like Matt Damon. That guy, the guy who looks like Matt Damon, but chubbier. And it really irked me because Phil refers to George all the way through the movie as Fatso. He's like, "Hi, Fatso, Fatso, Fatso," and I'm stop calling him fat. That's mean. That's your brother. It was unnecessarily mean of you, Phil, to call your brother Fatso, and that annoyed me, even though I do, in my head, refer to Jesse Plemons as Fat Matt Damon, and I feel really bad about that, but at least I'm like, well, it's not to his face, it's just in my head, it's fine. So, Phil and George share their childhood bedroom in their ranch house, which is, you know, and they go on this cattle drive with all of the people who work for them on the cattle ranch. And on the way back, nearly home, they stop at like a roadhouse, a place where they can stop and have food and some drinks and spend the night in an actual bed. And it's run by Kirsten Dunst, who in real life is Jesse Plemons' wife. And they have 2 children together, and so in real life they're husband and wife, but in the movie they are co-stars. And Kirsten Dunst has a son called Peter. So Kirsten Dunst's character is called Rose, and Peter, her son, is quite effeminate. He's very thin. The actor who plays him, extremely thin, a little bit like, oh, are you actually eating? Are you actually eating, dear? Because you look too thin. I think you need to have something bulk you out a little bit, because it's a little bit worrying as to how thin you are. And Peter is like a little bit effeminate, and he speaks with a very slight lisp. And Phil is horrible to him. Peter has made these beautiful paper flowers, like absolutely stunningly crafted, and he's put them on the table. And Phil, because he's a horrible person, like picks one up, sets it on fire, uses it to light a cigarette, and then dunks it out in the jug of water that's on the table. And I'm just like, oh, I'm like, Kirsten Dunst comes around and like angrily like gathers up all of the flowers, but I'm like, oh, I'd so pour that water on his head. I'd so pour that water on his head. He's such a horrible man. So because Phil is horrible to Rose, Rose ends up crying, and George like comforts her And to cut a long story short, they end up getting married. And Phil is not happy about this whatsoever. So Rose and George send off Peter to medical school, and Rose comes to the ranch to live with George and Phil. And Phil begins a sort of campaign of very intense bullying on Rose, which sort of culminates in some very aggressive banjo playing. Like, I've been bullied a lot in my life, and I don't know how I would handle a situation where I'm trying to play the piano and somebody is stood there aggressively playing the banjo at me. I don't think I'd be able to handle that either. And this is sort of the event which eventually tips Rose over the edge and leads her to begin like drinking, because she's so upset with Phil. So Peter comes home from medical school and he sees that his mother is very upset with Phil. Phil is horrible to her, and that his mother started drinking, and he's not very happy about this. See, Peter's father had died from a suicide, and Peter is the one who like found him and cut him down. Or is he? There's a little bit of implication in the movie. So Phil immediately begins picking on Peter again, but Peter is kind of like, my head is high, you will not get to me. And he stumbles across Phil when he's having a bath in mud. He's rubbing mud all over himself, and you get to see everything that Mr. Cumberbatch has to offer. And he's washing himself, and he has this scarf that belonged to his mentor, Bronco Henry, who he mentions in every breath. Every breath, he's like, Bronco Henry did this, Bronco Henry did that. I love Bronco Henry. He was my best friend. And he has this scarf that belonged to Bronco Henry, and it takes some special alone time with the scarf. And Peter discovers, as Phil is washing himself, that he has this little stash of art pamphlets of gentlemen who are nudes, and it has the name like Bronco Henry written on these art pamphlets full of nude gentlemen, and comes to the conclusion that perhaps Phil and Bronco Henry were more than little friends. You know, they might be those kind of friends. So Phil gets really angry at first, but then he kind of like decides he's going to take Peter under his wing. And as the audience, we don't know if this is because he's trying to like self-preserve himself, or if because he sees something in Peter that he recognises in himself. But he decides to take Peter under his wing and start teaching him how to like ride horses, and starts making him a rawhide lasso rope. So they go through this period where Peter and Phil are spending time together out on the ranch, learning to ride. Phil is making this rope. Peter is learning like various skills. At one point they go to mend this fence, and a little bunny rabbit breaks its leg. And Phil like says to Peter like, oh, you must put it out of its misery. And Peter's like, oh, the little bunny. Oh, what a lovely little bunny. There, little bunny. Snap its neck. And Phil's like, because he wasn't really expecting it. And this is one of sort of the inklings that you get from Peter throughout the movie, that maybe there's something else to him that, as the audience, we are not being a part of, we are not witnessing. Cats. So, Rose is driven absolutely mad by Phil's bullying, and Peter sees how bad his mother is, and there comes to an incident where Phil is almost finished doing this rope, and on the ranch they have these cattle hides, and if he's not going to use them, he burns them, which is terribly wasteful. and Rose ends up selling them to some Native Americans in exchange for like this pair of gloves. And Phil finds out about this, and he is not happy. And he's like, I'm going to kill her. I'm going to actually kill her for doing this. And Peter's like, no, Phil, it's fine, it's fine. I've got some rawhide, and you can use that to finish the rope. And Phil is like so moved by this gesture. He's like, oh my God, and he starts like tearing up. And he's like, wow, thank you, that's really kind, Pete. And like, they go to the barn, and he gives him this little tub of rawhide. And earlier in the movie, Phil cut his hand a little bit, and he put his hand in the water, and his blood is mixing with the rawhide. And what he isn't aware of is that Peter gathered this rawhide from a cow that was diseased with anthrax. An anthrax diseased cow. And he cut the rawhide off, and he put it in a bucket, and then he brought it to Phil, and he let him dink his hands into the rawhide that's infected with the anthrax. And then he starts finishing off this lasso. And while he's doing this, like, Peter, like, rolls this cigarette, and at this point, it's like, it's a seduction, and this is sort of a bit where the Hannibal sort of stuff comes into it, I suppose. If you're big into the Hannibal fandom, you will not need an explanation for this. But like, Peter rolls this cigarette, and he lights it up, and he begins like smoking it, and then he offers it out to Phil, like with his fingers, and like sort of like Phil takes it on Peter's fingers, and like they've got like eyes locked on each other, and it's like intense, and it's smouldering, and you're like, this is like the culmination of the seduction. Like, Peter has been seducing Phil, and this is like the culmination of it. Whether or not they had a little alone time in that barn remains unseen. We do not know. That's what fan fiction is for. So we cut to in the morning, and Peter is like, nowhere to be found. He's nowhere to be found, and Phil's anthrax hand is fully infected at this point, and he's like running around the farm, and he's got the lasso that's finished, and he spent weeks braiding this lasso, and he's like, where's the boy? I need to give it to him. And you can see like the desperation in his face that he can't find Peter. And Jesse Plemons is like, well, don't worry, Phil, don't worry, Phil. I will find Peter. I will give him the rope. Don't worry. I'll take you to the doctor. We'll get you to the doctor, see what the doctor says. And they take him to the doctor. But then the next scene, Jesse Plemons is picking out his coffin because he's dead. So, Rose is happy that Phil is dead, and Rose gives up drinking, and Peter is happy that Rose is happy, and he takes the lasso that Phil made for him and like stashes it under his bed, and the movie ends with Peter having seduced Phil and giving him anthrax. It was not at all what I was expecting the movie to be. I was expecting more of a standard Western, and not a sort of exploration of sexuality in a repressed era when, like, it wasn't okay for people to be openly gay, and I really wasn't expect to see, like, Benedict Cumberbatch get seduced by this, like, effeminate young man and have this, like, smouldering cigarette smoking scene in it. But that is what we got in the movie. So if you are somebody who's into, like, Hannibal, into the fandom side of things, and Brokeback Mountain is also kind of your thing, you know, you've got the gay cowboys, you've got the seduction of somebody, which is ultimately aimed to lead to their death. This might be a movie that you want to check out. The Power of the Dog. Highly recommend. It's probably going to end up on my top 10 list for this year, because I'm going to try and not be lazy and actually try to achieve a top 10 instead of a top 5 movies for this year. But yeah, this is the movie I didn't know I needed, but now it's part of my life, and there's only 20 fan fictions an archive of our own, it's so hard to say, archive of our own, 803, and I want to change this, so please go see the movie, and get into it, and start writing up some fan fictions, because it needs a little more love.